Poor Maid grabs the wrong suitcase at airport, unaware it belongs to a millionaire, and love blooms. The hum of activity filled JFK Airport on a dreary Wednesday evening. The crowds bustled with a mix of weary travelers and frantic families, all navigating the chaos of delayed flights and overbooked terminals. Among them was Sophia Carter, clutching the handle of a battered carry-on suitcase. Her eyes scanned the departures board, but her mind was elsewhere. Sophia was no stranger to airports, having left her hometown of Bridgeport, Connecticut, 2 years earlier. Back then, she had boarded a bus to New York City with nothing but her dreams and a few $100s saved from working at Maggie's Diner, the only place in town where her parents would allow her to work. Tonight, however, was different. The weight of her failure seemed heavier than the suitcase she dragged behind her. The interview at Le Bernardin, one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants, had been a disaster. The head chef barely looked at her resume before moving on to another candidate with a culinary school degree. Sophia had hoped her 2 years of working the line at a struggling diner in Queens would count for something. It didn't. "I'll call you if something opens up," the chef had said dismissively before disappearing into the kitchen, leaving her standing awkwardly in the bustling lobby. Her shoulders slumped as she replayed the moment in her mind, boarding the air train with a hollow ache in her chest. It wasn't just the rejection, it was the relentless reminder of her precarious life. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Her roommates were already eyeing her tiny room as a potential storage space, and her savings were dwindling fast. As the carousel churned out luggage from the incoming flight, Sophia waited among a sea of impatient passengers. Her bag, a simple black carry-on she had owned since high school, appeared on the belt. She grabbed it quickly, eager to escape the suffocating air of the terminal. She didn't notice the subtle difference in weight or the faint initials embossed near the handle, AH. Alexander Hayes was also in a hurry. His usual private jet was undergoing maintenance, forcing him to endure the indignity of commercial travel. Standing a few feet away, he frowned as he watched Sophia walk away with his suitcase. Oblivious, she joined the stream of passengers heading for the exit. By the time Alexander realized the mix-up, Sophia was gone. The subway rattled as Sophia made her way home, the suitcase wedged awkwardly between her legs. She leaned her head against the window, staring at her distorted reflection. It was hard to believe this was her life now. Her childhood had been so different, filled with summer picnics at Seaside Park, Sunday church at St. Mary's, and the smell of her mother's homemade cinnamon rolls. That life had ended abruptly when Sophia defied her family's wishes. Her parents, Mark and Catherine, had planned every detail of her life, from attending an Ivy League school to marrying Brian Matthews, the town's golden boy. When she refused, they disowned her, cutting her off both financially and emotionally. A sudden jolt of the train snapped her out of her thoughts. She glanced down at the suitcase and decided to unpack it immediately once she got home. Her roommates, Ashley and Jenna, weren't fond of clutter. The apartment was quiet when Sophia arrived, the only sound coming from a dripping faucet in the kitchen. She dragged the suitcase into her room and unzipped it, expecting to find her few belongings. Instead, she was met with an array of neatly folded designer suits, monogrammed shirts, and a sleek leather portfolio embossed with Hayes Enterprises. Her heart sank. This wasn't her suitcase. Panicking, she rifled through the contents, hoping to find a phone number or some sort of identification. At the bottom of the bag, she found a slim black notebook with an embossed AH on the cover. As she flipped it open, her eyes widened at the sight of detailed business notes, confidential documents, and a small black card with the name Alexander Hayes engraved in silver. Sophia froze. She had heard that name before. Alexander Hayes was the reclusive billionaire CEO whose company was at the forefront of artificial intelligence. His face occasionally graced the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, but he was notoriously private. She sank onto her bed, clutching the card. What would someone like him think if he knew his belongings were in her tiny, cluttered apartment? The thought was terrifying. She needed to return the suitcase immediately. But how? Meanwhile, Alexander wasn't wasting time. Using a tracker discreetly embedded in his luggage, he pinpointed the location of his suitcase to a modest apartment in Queens. He had no idea who Sophia Carter was, but he was determined to retrieve his belongings. As he sat in the back seat of his black Bentley, his mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? Why did she have his suitcase? And most importantly, was she a threat to his company? By the time Alexander arrived at the apartment, the tension in his chest was palpable. He wasn't sure what to expect when the door opened, but he certainly didn't expect Sophia. The knock on the door was sharp, almost impatient. Sophia froze, still clutching the business card bearing Alexander Hayes's name. Her heartbeat quickened, and a wave of unease settled over her. Visitors at this hour were rare, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this knock meant trouble. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but the knocking came again, louder this time. She placed the card carefully back in the suitcase, zipped it up, and tiptoed to the door. Peering through the peephole, she was met with a sight that made her breath hitch. Standing there, dressed impeccably in a dark grey suit, was a man she instantly recognized from magazine covers. Alexander Hayes himself. Sophia hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. Her mind raced with questions. Why was he here? How did he find her? What could she possibly say to him? Another knock, softer this time, interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Carter," came a deep, calm voice from the other side. "I believe you have something of mine." Sophia's eyes widened. He knew her name. Her fingers fumbled as she unlocked the door. When it swung open, Alexander's sharp blue eyes locked onto hers, scanning her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. He looked every bit the powerful CEO, tall, composed, and with an air of authority that filled the narrow hallway. I'm sorry," she stammered, stepping aside to let him in. "I didn't mean to take your suitcase. It was an accident." Alexander didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped into the apartment, his gaze sweeping the modest living space. The mismatched furniture, peeling paint, and cluttered bookshelves were a stark contrast to the luxury he was accustomed to. Sophia fidgeted nervously. "I was going to return it as soon as I realized. I just haven't had the chance yet." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate that," he said, his tone measured. "But this suitcase contains sensitive materials I cannot afford to lose." Sophia quickly moved to retrieve the suitcase from her room, dragging it into the living room. "Here it is," she said, pushing it toward him. "I didn't touch anything, well, except to find your card, but only so I could contact you." Alexander regarded her carefully, then crouched down to inspect the suitcase. He opened it, his movements precise, and began checking its contents. Sophia watched in silence, her stomach twisting with anxiety. When he finally zipped it up and stood, there was no relief in his expression. "It seems everything is in order," he said. "But tell me, Miss Carter, how did you end up with my suitcase?" She swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "It was a mistake. I grabbed it from the baggage carousel without realizing it wasn't mine. They look identical." "Identical?" His brow arched skeptically. Sophia nodded, her face heating with embarrassment. "Yes, mine's black too, old and scratched, but I guess I wasn't paying attention." Alexander's gaze lingered on her for a moment, his sharp features softened by curiosity. "And what were you doing at the airport?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, debating whether to answer. "I was coming back from an interview," she admitted quietly. "It didn't go well." Alexander tilted his head slightly, studying her. There was something about her nervous energy, the faint vulnerability in her voice that intrigued him. "What kind of interview?" "For a restaurant," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "I'm trying to become a chef." "A chef?" His tone was neutral, but Sophia thought she detected a hint of surprise. "Yes," she said more firmly this time. "But it's been hard to find opportunities without formal training. Most places won't even give me a chance." Alexander's expression remained impassive, but inside he felt a flicker of recognition. He had once been in her position, young, ambitious, and struggling to prove himself in a world that valued credentials over potential. Sophia shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "I really didn't mean any harm. I'm sorry for the trouble I caused." For a moment, Alexander said nothing. Then, with a slight nod, he stepped toward the door. "Apology accepted," he said, "and thank you for returning the suitcase." Sophia followed him, relief washing over her as he reached for the doorknob. But just as he opened the door, he paused and turned back to her. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice softer now, "if you ever find yourself in need of assistance, contact me." He handed her a sleek black business card, different from the one in the suitcase. It bore his name, phone number, and the logo of Hayes Enterprises. Before Sophia could respond, he was gone, leaving her standing in the doorway, card in hand. That night, Sophia lay in bed, staring at the card on her bedside table. She couldn't shake the image of Alexander Hayes from her mind, his commanding presence, his piercing gaze, the way he had looked at her as if seeing something she didn't even see in herself. She wanted to believe his offer was genuine, but her past experiences had taught her to be wary of kindness, especially from people like him, wealthy, powerful, and accustomed to getting what they wanted. And yet, as she drifted off to sleep, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder, could this be the start of something new? Something she never dared to dream of. Morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Sophia's room, casting pale streaks on the walls. She sat at her small wooden table, a chipped coffee mug in hand, staring down at the glossy black business card that Alexander Hayes had left behind. She had hardly slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see his piercing blue gaze, his calm yet commanding demeanor. The card felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the weight of her next decision. Calling him seemed ridiculous. What would she even say? Yet the idea of simply ignoring it felt wrong. This wasn't just any person. He was Alexander Hayes, a man with the power to open doors she didn't even know existed. Sophia's stomach growled, pulling her from her thoughts. She placed the card on the table and moved to the kitchen, where her two roommates were already bustling around. Ashley, dressed in scrubs for her nursing shift, was hurriedly buttering toast, while Jenna, a freelance graphic designer, sipped coffee and scrolled through her phone. "Morning," Sophia murmured, grabbing a slice of bread and popping it into the toaster. "Morning," Jenna replied without looking up. "You okay? You look distracted." Sophia hesitated. She hadn't told them about the suitcase mix-up or her encounter with Alexander Hayes. It sounded too surreal, like something out of a movie. "Yeah, just tired," she said instead, brushing off the question. Ashley glanced at her watch. "Well, whatever's on your mind. I hope it's good news. Lord knows we could all use some." She grabbed her bag and dashed out the door, leaving Sophia and Jenna alone. Sophia sipped her coffee in silence, her thoughts drifting back to the business card. What if calling him could change everything? What if it led to a real opportunity? By noon, Sophia couldn't stand the internal debate any longer. She sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, staring at the card as if it might burst into flames. "This is stupid," she muttered under her breath, but her fingers dialed the number anyway. The phone rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. "Alexander Hayes's office. This is Olivia speaking. How may I assist you?" Sophia's mouth went dry. She hadn't expected anyone else to answer. Hi. My name is Sophia Carter. Mr. Hayes gave me his card last night and said I could contact him if I needed help." There was a brief pause. "One moment, please." Sophia heard soft classical music as she was put on hold. She clutched the phone tightly, every second stretching endlessly. Just as she began to wonder if she'd made a mistake, the line clicked. "Sophia Carter," came Alexander's familiar voice, smooth and measured. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." Sophia swallowed hard. "I wasn't sure if I should call, but I wanted to thank you again for understanding about the suitcase. I assume this call isn't just to express gratitude," he said, his tone unreadable. She hesitated. "You said I could contact you if I needed help." I've been struggling to find work, and I thought maybe you might know someone who could give me a chance." The silence on the other end was deafening. Sophia felt a wave of regret. She had probably sounded desperate, pathetic even, but then Alexander spoke. "Come to my office tomorrow morning at 10. We'll discuss this further." Before she could respond, the call ended. The next morning, Sophia stood outside the towering glass building that housed Hayes Enterprises. She craned her neck, staring up at the sleek, modern structure that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. People in tailored suits and expensive heels streamed past her, moving with purpose. She tugged nervously at the hem of her thrifted blazer, suddenly hyper-aware of how out of place she looked. But she couldn't turn back now. Clutching the card in one hand, she stepped inside. The lobby was a masterpiece of minimalist design, polished marble floors, soaring ceilings, and a massive digital screen displaying images of Hayes Enterprises' innovations. Sophia approached the reception desk, her heart pounding. "I have an appointment with Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. The receptionist nodded and directed her to the elevator. As the doors closed, Sophia's reflection stared back at her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever awaited her upstairs. When she stepped into Alexander's office, the contrast between her small apartment and his world of luxury was staggering. The room was spacious and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Manhattan. Alexander stood by the window, his back to her, dressed impeccably as always. "Miss Carter," he said, turning to face her. "Punctuality. That's a good start." Sophia managed a small smile. "Thank you for meeting with me. Let's skip the pleasantries," he said, motioning for her to sit. "Tell me why you're here." Sophia sat down, feeling the weight of his gaze. "I'm here because I need an opportunity. I know I don't have the credentials most people look for, but I'm hard-working and I'm willing to learn." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're asking me to take a risk on you?" "Yes," she said, her voice firm despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I am." He was silent for a long moment, then stood and walked to his desk. "I've made a career out of taking calculated risks. This will be no different." Sophia blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, pulling out a folder, "I'm willing to give you a chance, but on my terms." "What kind of terms?" she asked cautiously. "I'll hire you as my temporary assistant," he said. "You'll have 3 months to prove yourself. If you succeed, I'll help you take the next step toward your career goals. If you fail, we part ways." Sophia's mind raced. This was more than she had hoped for, but the stakes were high. I'll do it," she said finally. "Good," Alexander said, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Then we'll see if you're as determined as you claim to be." Sophia stood in front of the mirror in her small bedroom, staring at her reflection with a mix of anxiety and determination. Her thrifted blazer and neatly pressed blouse looked professional enough, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to step into a world where appearances mattered far more than effort. She tucked a loose strand of her dark hair behind her ear and smoothed down the fabric of her skirt for what felt like the 100th time. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. A text from Jenna popped up. "You've got this. Just be yourself." Sophia smiled faintly, her nerves easing just a fraction. Slinging her bag over her shoulder, she took one last deep breath and headed out the door. The lobby of Hayes Enterprises was no less intimidating the second time. The sleek marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and the air buzzed with quiet efficiency. Men and women in tailored suits moved with a precision that made Sophia feel like an outsider. She approached the receptionist, the same woman from the day before, and introduced herself again. The receptionist gave her a polite smile and directed her to a different elevator this time, one reserved for executives. Sophia stepped inside, clutching the file Alexander had handed her the previous day. As the elevator ascended, the numbers ticking higher, she couldn't help but feel like each floor took her further from the life she had known. By the time the doors opened on the 50th floor, her palms were damp with nervous sweat. Waiting for her was a poised woman with sleek black hair tied into a low bun. She wore a sharp pencil skirt and a silk blouse, exuding an air of calm authority. "You must be Sophia," the woman said, extending a hand. "I'm Olivia Tran, Mr. Hayes's executive assistant." Sophia shook her hand, grateful for Olivia's warmth. "It's nice to meet you." "Follow me," Olivia said, turning on her heel. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she led Sophia through the expansive office space. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the walls, offering breathtaking views of the Manhattan skyline. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and expensive leather. As they reached Alexander's office, Olivia paused and turned to Sophia. "Before we go in, a piece of advice: be direct and concise. Mr. Hayes values efficiency above all else." Sophia nodded, swallowing her nerves. "Got it." Alexander's office was just as imposing as she remembered, with its towering bookshelves, modern furniture, and the ever-present view of the city. He stood behind his desk, typing on a laptop, his posture straight and focused. "Miss Carter," he said without looking up, "you're on time. A promising start." Sophia hesitated by the door, unsure whether to respond. Olivia gave her a small nudge forward before excusing herself and leaving them alone. "I assume Olivia briefed you on the basics of your responsibilities," Alexander said, finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. His tone was cool, professional, and just a touch intimidating. "She gave me an overview." "Yes," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Good." He closed his laptop and gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs across from his desk. "Your first task is simple. I need you to organize this." He motioned to a stack of documents and folders piled high on a side table. Sophia blinked. "All of this. By the end of the day," he said, "you'll find detailed instructions in the top folder. Follow them precisely." She nodded, determined to prove herself. "Understood." "Good." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with a critical eye. "Remember, Miss Carter, this is a test. I don't tolerate mistakes." Sophia spent the next several hours sorting through the documents. Each folder contained pages of financial reports, project updates, and legal contracts, all of which needed to be categorized, cross-referenced, and labeled. The instructions were clear but overwhelming in their detail. She worked diligently, her focus unbroken. Occasionally, Olivia stopped by to check on her progress, offering a few words of encouragement. "You're doing fine," she said once, handing Sophia a cup of coffee. "Just pace yourself." By midday, Sophia's back ached from sitting in the same position for so long, but she refused to slow down. She double-checked every label and cross-reference, determined to meet Alexander's exacting standards. At one point, as she flipped through a particularly thick folder, she noticed a page out of place. Panic bubbled in her chest as she realized it belonged in another file she had already finished organizing. Scrambling to fix the mistake, she knocked over a stack of sorted folders, sending papers scattering across the floor. "Great," she muttered, dropping to her knees to gather the mess. Her hands trembled slightly as she reshuffled the documents, fearing the mistake would cost her the chance she had been given. She had just finished putting everything back in order when Alexander appeared in the doorway. His sharp gaze swept over the scene, lingering on the slightly disheveled stack of folders. "Everything under control?" he asked, his tone neutral but edged with curiosity. Sophia straightened, clutching the last folder to her chest. "Yes, Mr. Hayes, just a minor mishap. I've fixed it." His expression remained unreadable as he stepped into the room, picking up one of the completed folders and flipping through it. After a moment, he nodded. "Good. I expect the rest to be just as thorough." By the time Sophia finished, it was nearly 7 p.m. Exhausted but satisfied, she carried the neatly organized stack of folders to Alexander's office. He looked up from his desk as she approached, his expression impassive. "Done?" he asked. "Yes," she said, placing the stack on his desk. "Everything is labeled and cross-referenced as per your instructions." He inspected the top folder briefly before nodding. "Efficient. You've passed the first test." Sophia allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," he said, his tone cool. "This is only the beginning." As Sophia left the office that night, the city lights glimmering around her, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. It was just one day, one small step, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving towards something greater. She clutched her bag tightly as she descended into the subway, her mind already racing with thoughts of what the next day would bring. One thing was certain: Alexander Hayes was going to push her limits, and she was ready for the challenge. The next morning, the city was draped in grey skies, the kind that made Manhattan feel even colder than it was. Sophia arrived at Hayes Enterprises 15 minutes early, her mind still swirling from the previous day. She'd spent most of the night replaying Alexander's words, "This is only the beginning." The weight of that statement lingered in her chest, a reminder of the stakes she was playing for. In the break room, she poured herself a cup of coffee from the industrial machine, the bitter aroma filling the small space. As she stirred in a splash of creamer, Olivia entered, carrying a neatly organized binder. "Good morning," Olivia greeted, her tone warm yet professional. "Morning," Sophia replied, trying not to sound as nervous as she felt. Olivia glanced at the coffee in Sophia's hand. "You'll need that today. Mr. Hayes has an intense schedule, and he wants you shadowing him for most of it." Sophia blinked in surprise. Shadowing him? Why? "It's part of his way of testing people," Olivia explained, placing the binder on the counter. "He likes to see how you handle pressure, observing, listening, anticipating needs. It's not easy, but if you do well, it'll leave an impression." Sophia nodded slowly, a mix of excitement and dread pooling in her stomach. She thanked Olivia and returned to her desk, determined to prove herself once again. At precisely 9 a.m., Alexander emerged from his office, already dressed in a dark navy suit that made him look as polished as the skyscrapers surrounding them. His sharp features were set in a neutral expression, but his eyes carried the same intensity Sophia had noticed from the beginning. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone brisk, "come with me." She quickly grabbed a notepad and pen, falling into step beside him as he strode down the hallway. His long strides forced her to move faster than usual, and she could feel the curious glances of other employees as they passed. Their first stop was a conference room on the 48th floor, where Alexander was meeting with the heads of his marketing and research departments. The room was a flurry of activity charts projected on the wall, voices discussing key performance indicators, and assistants distributing packets of data. Sophia slid into an empty chair at the corner of the table, trying to absorb everything while staying out of the way. Alexander's presence dominated the room, his voice steady and commanding as he dissected strategies and demanded results. At one point he glanced at her and said, "Miss Carter, take notes." Her heart raced as she opened her notepad, trying to keep up with the rapid flow of information. Marketing campaigns, market share analysis, competitor strategies. It was overwhelming, but she forced herself to stay focused. She couldn't afford to miss a detail. After the meeting, Alexander handed her a cup of coffee from a nearby cart as they walked back to his office. The gesture surprised her. It wasn't the kind of thing she'd expected from him. "You held up better than I anticipated," he remarked, his tone almost teasing. Sophia managed a small smile. "Thank you, I think." He glanced at her, his expression softening just enough to hint at approval. The ability to adapt quickly is a valuable skill. Keep that in mind. Back in his office, Alexander returned to his desk while Sophia sat across from him, reviewing her notes. For a while the only sound was the faint tapping of his keyboard and the occasional rustle of paper. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Why cooking?" Sophia looked up, startled by the unexpected question. "Excuse me, why did you choose cooking?" he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "You said yesterday it's your dream, but you didn't explain why." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It's always been my way of expressing myself," she said slowly. "When I was younger, I'd watch cooking shows with my mom. She loved experimenting in the kitchen. It was the one thing we bonded over." Alexander studied her, his expression unreadable. And now? Now Sophia paused, her throat tightening. Now it's all I have. It's the only thing that still feels like mine. Her honesty surprised even herself, but she didn't regret it. Alexander didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting toward the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. I understand what it's like to cling to something that feels like your own. Sophia's brow furrowed. You do? He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the skyline. When I started Hayes Enterprises, I was barely out of college. I had nothing but an idea, and a lot of people telling me I was crazy. Building this company was my way of proving them wrong, and proving something to myself. Sophia felt a flicker of connection in his words, an unexpected glimpse of vulnerability behind the polished exterior. And did it work? Did you prove it? Alexander's lips curved into a faint, almost wistful smile. In some ways, yes. In others, I'm still figuring that out. For the first time, the distance between them seemed to shrink. Sophia saw a side of Alexander that was rarely, if ever, visible, the man behind the empire, grappling with his own insecurities and motivations. I think everyone's still figuring it out, she said quietly, surprising herself with her boldness. He met her gaze, and for a brief moment the intensity in his eyes softened. Perhaps you're right. The moment passed quickly as Alexander straightened in his chair, his professional demeanor returning. You've done well today, Miss Carter. Keep it up. Sophia nodded, feeling both encouraged and overwhelmed. As she left his office, she couldn't help but replay their conversation in her mind. It wasn't just about her proving herself anymore. She was beginning to understand that Alexander Hayes was more than the intimidating CEO he appeared to be. That evening, as Sophia walked home through the bustling streets of Manhattan, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The day had been intense, but it had also given her a glimpse of something she hadn't expected possibility, not just for her career, but for a connection she hadn't realized she was missing. She stopped at a small food cart on the corner, buying a hot pretzel and sitting on a nearby bench. As she chewed, she thought about Alexander's words, about the way his gaze had softened when he talked about his past. For the first time, she began to wonder if this job would change more than just her professional life. Maybe, just maybe, it would change her as a person. Chapter 6. A Crack in the Armor. Sophia arrived at the office earlier than usual the next morning, the sun still low on the horizon, casting a pale orange glow over the Manhattan skyline. The air felt brisk, a reminder that winter was only a few weeks away. As she stepped into the elevator, she took a steadying breath, determined to keep up the momentum she'd built over the last 2 days. Her resolve, however, didn't stop the nagging thought at the back of her mind: Alexander Hayes. The glimpse of vulnerability he had shown her yesterday lingered, a faint echo she couldn't quite shake. She couldn't decide if it had made him seem more human, or if it had complicated the image she'd built of him as an untouchable, calculating CEO. When Sophia entered Alexander's office, she was surprised to find him already there. He stood by the window, his phone pressed to his ear, his jaw tight as he listened to whoever was on the other end. His usual composed demeanor was replaced with a tension she hadn't seen before. "I've told you," he said sharply into the phone. "We don't negotiate with threats. If they want to play hardball, they can expect the same in return." He paused, his gaze flickering toward Sophia as she set her bag down quietly. "Handle it, or I will." He ended the call and exhaled slowly, his shoulders stiff. For a moment, the office was silent except for the faint hum of the city below. Then he turned to Sophia, his expression softening just slightly. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice less harsh now. "Good morning." "Good morning," she replied, sensing that something was off. "Is everything all right?" Alexander hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if deciding how much to share. Finally, he gestured for her to sit. "Let's just say it's been a morning." Sophia sat down, her curiosity piqued. "Is there anything I can help with?" A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I appreciate the offer, but this is above your pay grade for now. His words were casual, but Sophia couldn't miss the weight behind them. Something serious was happening, something that clearly unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Before she could dwell on it further, he slid a folder across the desk toward her. Your task today is to assist Olivia in finalizing preparations for the annual gala, he said. It's one of our largest events, and every detail needs to be perfect. Sophia nodded, flipping through the folder. The gala was a charity event hosted by Hayes Enterprises, with attendees ranging from top executives to political figures. The stakes were high, and she could see why Alexander wanted everything to run smoothly. Sophia spent the next few hours working closely with Olivia, reviewing vendor contracts, seating arrangements, and guest lists. The sheer scale of the event was overwhelming, but Olivia's calm efficiency made it easier to keep up. This gala is Mr. Hayes's pride and joy, Olivia explained as they double-checked catering details. He personally oversees every aspect of it, even though he pretends he doesn't care about the fanfare. Sophia raised an eyebrow. Why does he go through all this trouble if he doesn't care? Olivia smirked. Because deep down, he does care. He just doesn't like to admit it. This event raises millions for education initiatives, and it's one of the few times he lets his guard down well, slightly. Sophia absorbed Olivia's words, filing them away alongside everything else she'd learned about Alexander. The more she worked with him, the more she realized there were layers to him that she hadn't anticipated. Late in the afternoon, Sophia was on her way to deliver a revised guest list to Alexander's office when she overheard voices coming from inside. She paused outside the door, unsure whether to interrupt. I'm not interested in excuses. Alexander's voice was sharp, his usual calm replaced with frustration. We've come too far to let this fall apart now. The second voice belonged to a man Sophia didn't recognize. I'm just saying, Alex, you can't handle everything on your own. You need to delegate or you'll burn out. I've managed just fine so far, Alexander shot back. I don't need. The door opened abruptly, and Sophia found herself face to face with a man who bore a striking resemblance to Alexander, though his features were softer, his demeanor less intense. Oh, the man said, surprised. And who might you be? Sophia blinked, caught off guard. I'm Sophia Carter. I work for Mr. Hayes. The man's eyes lit up with amusement. I see. Another one of his tests, I presume. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Miss Carter, he said, ignoring the man's comment. Do you have the guest list? Yes, she said quickly, handing it to him. Thank you. That'll be all for now. Sophia hesitated, sensing the tension between the two men, but she nodded and left without another word. As she walked away, she couldn't help but wonder who the man was, and why he seemed to know Alexander so well. That evening, Sophia stayed late to finish updating a spreadsheet for the gala. The office was quiet, most of the employees having already gone home. She was packing up to leave when Alexander appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and a tired look in his eyes. You're still here? He asked, his voice softer than usual. I wanted to finish this, she replied, holding up the spreadsheet. He nodded, stepping into the room and leaning against the desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching comfortably between them. The man you saw earlier, Alexander said suddenly, breaking the silence. That was my brother, Daniel. Sophia looked at him, surprised by his openness. Your brother? He nodded, his gaze distant. He's been concerned about me lately. Thinks I take on too much. Do you? Sophia asked before she could stop herself. Alexander chuckled softly, a rare sound that caught her off guard. Sometimes, but I've never been good at letting go of control. Sophia smiled faintly. Maybe he just wants to help. Maybe, Alexander said, his tone thoughtful. But trust isn't something I give easily. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sophia wanted to ask more, to understand the cracks in his armor, but she knew better than to push. Well, she said gently, if you ever do decide to let someone help, I think it's a good thing. No one can do everything alone. Alexander studied her for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he straightened, his professional demeanor slipping back into place. Thank you, Miss Carter. That'll be all for tonight. As he left, Sophia couldn't help but feel that their conversation, however brief, had left an impression on both of them. The week of the gala was a test of endurance for everyone at Hayes Enterprises, but especially for Sophia. Days blurred into nights as she balanced her usual workload with the increasing demands of finalizing the event. Every detail from the floral arrangements to the timing of the keynote speeches was scrutinized by Alexander and Olivia. It was exhausting, but Sophia felt a sense of pride in knowing she was contributing to something significant. By the time the night of the gala arrived, exhaustion had given way to nervous anticipation. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was a dazzling display of opulence. Towering crystal chandeliers reflected the golden glow of ornate sconces, while elegantly set tables stretched across the room. Attendees in designer gowns and tuxedos mingled beneath the grandeur, sipping champagne and exchanging polished pleasantries. Sophia stood at the edge of the room, her clipboard a steady presence in her hands. She had chosen a simple black dress for the occasion, one borrowed from Jenna, and paired it with small pearl earrings her mother had given her years ago. She felt out of place among the city's elite, but she refused to let it show. Miss Carter. Alexander's voice came from behind her, and she turned to see him approaching, his presence as commanding as ever. He wore a tailored black tuxedo, his hair neatly combed, exuding effortless confidence. "You're doing well," he said, his sharp blue eyes scanning her face briefly before settling on the clipboard in her hands. "Everything is on schedule, I assume." "Yes," Sophia replied, her voice steady. "Everything is running smoothly." "Good." His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, and for the first time she thought she saw something in his expression that wasn't purely professional. Something softer, almost contemplative. Before she could think too much of it, he nodded curtly and turned to greet a group of guests. Later that evening, while ensuring the caterers were replenishing the hors d'oeuvres, Sophia caught sight of Alexander stepping into a side corridor. His usually composed demeanor seemed slightly frayed, his shoulders tense as he walked with purpose. Moments later, Daniel appeared from the same direction, his expression clouded with frustration. Sophia hesitated, debating whether to follow. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she made her way discreetly toward the corridor, careful not to draw attention. She stopped just short of the hallway, the low hum of their voices carrying toward her. "Alex, you can't keep doing this." Daniel's voice was sharp but tinged with concern. "You think running this company like a machine will make everything else disappear, but it won't." "I don't need this tonight, Daniel," Alexander replied, his tone clipped. "The gala is a success. Isn't that enough?" "No, it's not," Daniel said firmly. "This isn't just about the company. You're isolating yourself. You can't keep shutting people out." "I'm not shutting people out," Alexander snapped, though his voice lacked its usual edge of confidence. Sophia's breath caught as she listened. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the rawness of their exchange was impossible to ignore. Daniel's words painted a picture of Alexander she hadn't fully seen before, a man driven not only by ambition but also by a deep fear of vulnerability. The conversation ended abruptly as Daniel stormed past her, his expression tight. He noticed her standing there but said nothing, giving her only a brief nod before disappearing into the crowd. Sophia's heart raced as she considered what she'd just heard. The image of Alexander Hayes, the unflappable, commanding CEO, was beginning to crack. As the evening wound down, Sophia spotted Alexander standing alone on the balcony. The crowd inside had begun to thin, and the soft hum of the city provided a welcome contrast to the night's buzz of activity. She hesitated, unsure if she should approach him, but something about his posture, the way his shoulders sagged ever so slightly, compelled her to step forward. "Mr. Hayes?" she said softly, careful not to startle him. He turned, his sharp features illuminated by the warm glow of the ballroom's lights spilling onto the balcony. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Shouldn't you be inside ensuring everything is perfect?" She smiled faintly. "Everything is under control. I thought you might need some air." His lips curved slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "You're observant." Sophia joined him by the railing, the crisp night air brushing against her skin. "It's been a long night," she said. "You should be proud of how it turned out." Alexander was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the city below. "Pride is fleeting," he said finally. "Success is expected. It's the failures that linger." Sophia frowned, surprised by the admission. "You think tonight was a failure?" "No," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "But there's always the question of what comes next. And no matter how much you achieve, there's always something missing." Sophia hesitated, sensing the weight of his words. "Maybe it's not about what comes next," she said gently. "Maybe it's about letting yourself appreciate what you've already done." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "That sounds simpler than it is." "Most things do," she said with a faint smile. "Doesn't mean it's not worth trying." Alexander studied her for a long moment, and she felt the intensity of his gaze like a spotlight. "You have an unusual way of seeing the world, Miss Carter." "Maybe it's just a different way," she replied. "Sometimes a fresh perspective can help." He chuckled softly, a rare sound that caught her off guard. "You might be right." The conversation shifted something between them, though neither of them said as much. When they returned to the ballroom, Alexander's usual guarded demeanor was firmly back in place, but Sophia noticed subtle differences. He glanced her way more often, and his instructions carried a touch more warmth. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander sought her out once more, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone almost hesitant, "you've done excellent work tonight. I wanted to thank you personally." Sophia blinked, startled by the praise. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. That means a lot." He hesitated, then extended his hand. "Call me Alexander." Her breath hitched, but she took his hand, her own trembling slightly. "All right, Alexander." For the first time a genuine smile crossed his face, and in that moment Sophia felt something shift between them, a fragile but undeniable connection. That night, as Sophia walked home through the quiet streets of Manhattan, she felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The gala had been a success, but more importantly, she felt she had begun to understand Alexander Hayes, not just the powerful CEO, but the man behind the title. Her thoughts swirled with possibilities. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving towards something meaningful, and as she looked up at the city lights, she couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning. And so, what started as a simple mistake at an airport became the beginning of something extraordinary. 2 lives, shaped by ambition, struggle and resilience, found their way toward healing and connection. It's a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected turns in life lead us to exactly where we're meant to be. If this story touched your heart or left you inspired, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring more stories of hope, growth, and transformation to life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.